Well, good evening to our viewers here in Denmark. Thank you very much for being with us, but especially good afternoon to you, Michael Sandel. Are you in Boston or in Cambridge? You're in Massachusetts, right?
I am, yes, just at my home just outside of Boston, Rune. It's great to be with you.
It's great. It's great to have the chance to talk to you. I've been reading your books for many years, and your critique of liberalism very early was so enlightening and so inspiring. We've been talking a lot about your books here at the newspaper, and so finally getting the chance to talk to you is so gratifying. Thank you so much for taking your time.
No, thank you for having me.
I want to ask you first about this very special moment that you're in politically in America. And I think watching from abroad, it's very hard to figure out how serious it actually is. You seem generally in America very alarmed about what took place 1 week ago at Capitol Hill. And we were just expecting a new beginning for America, the end of the Trump presidency and a new beginning with Joe Biden and the Democratic majority in House of Representatives in control of the Senate. And now you have this horrible event taking place. What are your reflections on this very special moment in America?
The attack on the Capitol was the dramatic culmination of what's been going on for 4 years, which has been a presidency that has violated every norm of constitutional democracy. So while the event was shocking, in retrospect, in a way, sadly, it was continuous with the experience of the last 4 years. And the question is how we will emerge from this. And what it suggests is that although Donald Trump was defeated and is leaving office in a few days, the forces that produced him are still there. And so the future of democracy in America will depend very much on how effectively we can contend with these forces that for which Donald Trump was only the visible expression.
Your book, your latest book, The Tyranny of Merit, that I've been looking forward to since I heard a talk online with you 3 years ago, and I knew that it was on its way, this book, and it fulfilled all our expectations. It's a very ambitious book trying to really say what are the lessons to be learned from the Trump presidency, what produced this surprising event and this surprising political moment in American history. If you look at the liberal America in general, the media, the Democrats, and the liberal intellectuals, do you think they've learned the lessons over the last 4 years? Are they smarter today?
Unfortunately, I don't think so, Rune, for the following reason. I think that many people interpret support for Donald Trump simply as an expression of racism and xenophobia, hostility to immigrants and to the growing diversity of the country. And that is certainly an important part of the appeal of Donald Trump, but it's not the whole story. And so my concern is that the Democratic Party and liberal elites have not fully come to terms with the conditions that led to the rise of Donald Trump and to the support for him. And that's really why I wrote the book, The Tyranny of Merit. The theme of the book is that the divide between winners and losers has been deepening in recent decades, poisoning our politics, pulling us apart. And this has partly to do with the deepening inequality brought about by 4 decades of neoliberal globalization. But it's not only the economic inequality. It's also to do with changing attitudes towards success that have come with it. Those on top have come to believe that their success is their own doing, the measure of their merit, and that those who've been left behind have no one to blame but themselves. So the book is really an attempt to analyze how the last 4 decades in the management of the economy and also in developments in the culture, in these attitudes towards success and failure, winning and losing, have created the anger and resentment that opened the way to Trump.
We would historically say that the parties on the left, they're critical of the upper classes. They're defending the farmers and the working classes and the common man against the rich people. And we would say that the elites, they are represented by the right. But it seems that you've seen a great realignment in America. So actually, some of the elites that you're talking about now are represented in the Democratic Party and by the Democratic Party. Is that correct?
Yes. The Democratic Party in recent decades has become the party of well-educated, well-credentialed, professional class. And this represents a flip, a change, a reversal, really. Traditionally, as you suggest, Rune, the Democratic Party, as the center-left party, represented working people. And now, a great many working people have voted for Donald Trump, especially if you look at the divide by education. In 2016, two-thirds of white voters without a college degree, two-thirds voted for Donald Trump. And in the last election, in 2020, two-thirds of these voted again for Donald Trump. And so education has become one of the deepest divides in American politics. And what's interesting is that something similar is happening in other democracies. If you look at the vote for Brexit, overwhelmingly, those without a university degree voted for Brexit. Those with an advanced degree voted to remain, for Britain to remain in the European Union. The Labour Party in Britain has become the party of well-educated professionals. And the same is true in France, where Marine Le Pen her party appeals mainly to voters without college education. So education has been one of the deep divides in politics in this age of authoritarian populist backlash.
We're used to thinking of education as an agent of social mobility and saying, well, education is really the great equalizer. And over the last 20, 30 years in Europe as well in America, you've seen social democrats saying, well, education is the solution to everything. It's how we deal with globalization. It's how we deal with inequality. But you're very bold in your analysis in the book in showing how education is actually producing inequality and actually producing a new upper class. How did this huge change take place?
It took place as the politics of center-left parties came to focus on, well, let me take one step back. Center-left parties after the 1980s, after the age of Ronald Reagan and Margaret Thatcher, center-left parties came in. But they did not question the fundamental market faith, the market premise of the Reagan-Thatcher era, namely that markets are the primary mechanisms for defining and achieving the public good. When Bill Clinton in the US, Tony Blair in Britain, Gerhard Schroeder in Germany came into office and governed in the 1990s, they softened the harsh edges of the market faith, but they didn't challenge the fundamental premise. They embraced a market-driven version of globalization, and they said the gains to the winners we can use to compensate the losses to the losers. That's how they viewed it. Problem is that compensation didn't happen. And these center-left parties increasingly failed to attend the inequalities that resulted. The way they responded to the deepening inequalities into the wage stagnations was to offer individual upward mobility through college education. They told people, if you want to compete and win in the global economy, get a university degree. What you earn will depend on what you learn. This was the slogan of the time. Now, this seems on the surface to be inspiring. encouraging people to go to college. That's a good thing in and of itself. But as a response to inequality and as a response to wage stagnation, there's actually an insult implicit in this advice. Go to college, go to university. The insult is this: if you haven't been to university, and if you're struggling in the new economy, your failure must be your fault. You didn't get the diploma we told you you need. And so I think this meritocratic promise, I call it the rhetoric of rising, it lost its capacity to inspire, partly because social mobility stalled. It's much harder to rise one generation to the next in the US and in Britain than it is in Denmark and in some other European countries. So the American dream, one could almost say, is alive and well and living in Copenhagen if we look at actual rates of upward mobility. But the emphasis on a college degree, a university degree, had the effect of disparaging and demoralizing those without a university degree. And it's easy to forget, most people don't have one. The majority of Americans and of Europeans do not have a four-year university diploma. So this, I think, was the folly, the mistake of center-left parties, to give up on confronting inequality directly and to focus instead on individual upward mobility through university education, which didn't begin to address the problem, and it conveyed an insult to working people who contribute in important ways to the common good, but without a university diploma.
Could it be then, I was thinking when I read your book, that the animosity towards Barack Obama is not, as we would often assume, a racist bias. They don't want to be ruled by a black man, but more that Barack Obama is the icon of this neoliberal meritocracy, that he's the one who took the opportunity and came from the lower classes and became a professor at Harvard and a very, very skilled scholar. So he proved that he's a winner in that system. And when you look at him, he can do it. So why can't I do it? Could it be that the animosity of the right against him is just because he's the icon of exactly that moral order that you are suggesting?
In part, but here it's important to be careful. In parts, among some of the Trump voters, there is a white supremacist, racist strand. And the fact that Donald Trump came to political prominence in part through questioning whether Barack Obama had been born in the United States, that is a part of Donald Trump's political appeal. So there is a racist dimension, and we should not deny that or overlook that. At the same time, there is also truth in what you suggest. And I try to bring this out in the book. I am critical in some ways of Barack Obama. I should say I voted for him twice. And I voted for him even in the Democratic primary when he was facing Hillary Clinton. So I voted for him actually 3 times. But I am critical of him in the book. He was enormously capable. But he, like many leaders of center-left political parties, he did not have a keen ear for the sense of humiliation and resentment experienced by working class voters who heard his emphasis on rising through a university degree and found this demoralizing and insulting. He didn't hear that, just as Bill Clinton before him didn't hear it, just as many center-left political leaders in Europe didn't quite understand the anger and resentment that a meritocratic political project can produce, emphasizing individual mobility through university education as the answer to wage stagnation, as the answer to deepening inequality, is the answer to the sense of disempowerment that many working people felt as their jobs were outsourced during the years of globalization this missed something. And so I think center-left parties, including Barack Obama, did have a kind of blind spot and didn't hear the insult implicit in what they thought was a realistic and even inspiring message of encouraging people to rise. You can make it if you try. This is one of Barack Obama's slogans.
Well, you use a phrase in the book that was very, very precise. You say that we have a hereditary aristocracy, that the universities have turned into aristocracies of heritage, even, that not only are they upper classes, but they're reproducing themselves. How do you see that?
There is intense competition, as you can imagine, for admission to top universities in the United States. Such intense competition that recently we had a scandal, and I write about it in the book, of some wealthy parents, some of them celebrities, hiring a corrupt private college counselor who had an organized system of bribes to get their children admitted to top universities. What this shows is how central universities, and especially selective universities, have become to the allocation of opportunity in a meritocratic society. And so what we've done is we've put universities in the role of being arbiters of opportunity. They are the ones who define the merit and confer the credentials that a market-driven meritocratic society rewards. So there is intense competition for admission. On the face of it, where admission is by merit, by grades and standardized tests, it would seem to be a system of fair, equal opportunity. Everyone is free to take these entrance exams and to submit their applications. And meritocracy in this way seemed to be a welcome democratic departure from the old system back 60, 70, 80 years ago, when only the children of the privileged were admitted to places like Harvard, my university. But what's happened is that affluent parents have figured out how to pass their advantages onto their kids, not by bequeathing them large estates or trusts or money, but by equipping them with the educational and the cultural advantages that enable them to compete effectively in getting high test scores. The higher the family income, the higher the likelihood of scoring well on these college entrance exams. And so as a result, even colleges and universities like mine, with generous policies of financial aid for students who can't afford the fees, even despite these generous scholarship schemes, most people come from well-off families, most of the students. And here's an especially dramatic measure of this. At the Ivy League American universities, the 8 or 10 or 12 very competitive universities, there are more students from families in the top 1% than there are students from the bottom half of the income scale combined. So even though admission is meritocratic, it has devolved into a system where the successful can enable their children to reproduce their success, not strictly speaking through a hereditary title, but by all of the educational and cultural advantages that enable young people to compete effectively for admission to universities, which now serve this role of allocating opportunity in a meritocratic society.
I was thinking of Pierre Bourdieu's analysis of the French educational system when I read your book, because there are some resemblances.
Yes.
Using the metaphor of aristocracy to show how inequality is reproduced. But in Bourdieu's analysis of the French educational system of the 60s and 70s, there's the conflict between economic capital and cultural capital. That either if you have access to the great universities and you have a lot of cultural capital, you're usually against the rich. And if you're rich, you don't have the cultural capital. But what you're describing in your book is actually that it seems that cultural capital and economic capital, they merge together in these universities.
They are coming closer and closer together. And so this would be one shift from the time when Bourdieu was observing. They are coming, they're not the same, but they are coming, the overlap between them is quite considerable. And the universities, as they now function, bring them closer and closer together. And this is part of the problem, because the effect is that where once meritocracy was seen as the solution to inequality, now meritocracy is not only consistent with inequality, it provides a justification for inequality, because it says if chances are more or less equal, then those who land on top deserve their winnings. They've earned it. They've done it on their own. And so in this way, now, of course, one could argue that chances are not truly equal. And of course, they're not. But the project of trying to perfect the meritocracy, of trying to remove barriers to fair competition, all of that's a good thing. But even if it succeeded, even if we had a perfectly fair starting point for everyone, it would still be the case that meritocracy would promote and justify inequality. And this, I think, suggests that the flaw in meritocracy is not only that we fail to live up to it. The flaw is in the ideal itself, in dividing winners and losers on the basis of talent and effort.
And it seems there's also a thought that's been going through all your work, that's a critique of individualism. That is, of course, in America, but we know it here as as well. There's a certain sense in our societies that freedom is something that we produce for ourselves, by ourselves. And it seems to me that you try to point out the social premises for freedom, and you want to recommend another conception of freedom. Isn't that correct?
Yes. And in some of the earlier work to which you've referred, Rune, I've drawn a contrast between a consumerist conception of freedom and a civic conception of freedom. And I mean the following. The consumerist idea of freedom says we are free when we can get what we want, when we can act on our desires unimpeded as individuals. The civic conception of freedom says simply being able to get what I want as an individual is not true freedom. It's only the very limited kind of freedom that the marketplace can satisfy. Buying and selling and consuming goods together. The civic conception of freedom says we're only really free if we share in self-rule, if we can deliberate with fellow citizens as equals and shape the destiny of the community as a whole. So freedom understood as a civic project involves more than simply being able to act on my desires and as an individual. It requires a certain kind of common life, the kind of common life that cultivates a sense of shared citizenship and of mutual responsibility and that empowers citizens to have a meaningful and effective voice about the destiny of their political community. I think part of the frustration that citizens of democracies around the world are voicing today is a sense of disempowerment. And the disempowerment is connected to the lack of civic freedom, the sense that our voices don't matter, that they aren't heard, that we really aren't engaged in a shared project of collective deliberation about the kind of society we want, about the meaning of the common good. So it's true, my work has been arguing against a purely market-based, consumerist idea of individual freedom, trying to articulate and defend and point the way toward a more demanding civic notion of freedom, which requires that we think of ourselves as members of a community, not just as individual consumers in the marketplace.
When you look at America now, I think Americans agree that polarization in America is bad. I think there is a longing on both sides for a kind of unity. Isn't that correct? That they agree that their fundamental cultural wars or their fundamental disagreements are bad for themselves and bad for the country.
Yes, there is that sense, though we're not clear on what to do about it. We're not clear on how we might overcome the polarization and achieve the kind of healing and unity that everyone, almost everyone, except those people invading the Capitol, but almost everyone across the political spectrum wants. And I think the reason we're having trouble finding our way to a politics of the common good, which is the way I would express the aspiration for unity, the reason we're having trouble achieving that is I don't think we have had an adequate diagnosis of how we landed in this problem in the first place. Just to connect the critique of meritocratic competition and this idea of individual striving and success, to connect that with this aspiration for the common good. The heart of it is this, I think, Rune. If we think that our success is our own doing, the measure of our merit, then it's easy to forget the luck and good fortune that helped us on our way. It's easy to forget the sense in which we are indebted for our success to family, to teachers, to neighborhood, to community, to country, to the times in which we live. We are indebted to all sorts of contingencies and sources of help. And so the more I think of my success as my own doing, the harder it is to imagine myself in other people's shoes. But a greater sense of the role of luck in life, of good fortune, can prompt a certain humility there, but for the accident of fate or the grace of God or the luck of the draw go I. So this sense of humility and appreciation of the role of luck in life can open us, I think, to a politics of the common good, to a greater sense of solidarity than is possible if we think of freedom in entirely individualistic terms.
When I was following the primaries, of course, and I was going there with my son, who's a great fan of Bernie Sanders. So we were driving around watching the rallies and really appreciated this Tocquevillian primaries experience, this vibrant energy and this true and really impressive engagement of American citizens, really, that we don't see here. This is an aspect of American democracy that we really admire. I was so struck by how a lot of what you're saying was what they were saying, the candidates, how Elizabeth Warren would say, well, good for you if you're a successful businessman. You owe a lot to the people who build the bridges, who build the highways. So you owe a lot to the weather, that the premises of your personal success are social and some of them are fortunate. And when listening to Bernie Sanders talking about what we should do for the working classes, how we should raise the minimum wage, I thought, well, they are not leaving the conflict with neoliberalism to the conservatives. They're taking it themselves. So I was very hopeful watching that, because I know they didn't win, but they were shaping the debate. And I think you see a lot of it in Biden, his kind of progressive protectionism, his Build Back Better, his industrial policies are very promising aspects, I think. But then I read in your book what Hillary Clinton said, that she won about a fifth of the districts in the American elections, 20% of the districts, but they produced 2/3 of the American economy. And then I saw just a week ago that Joe Biden, he won 500 out of 3,000 districts that produced 71% of the American GDP. So what should we expect from these Democrats? Are they starting to understand the working classes, or are they increasingly becoming the party of the upper classes?
It's a complicated question for exactly the reasons that you observed when you were here with your son. You're right. Elizabeth Warren did speak from time to time about success not being only an individual achievement. And Bernie Sanders did speak about the need to create a more generous system of social provision and public provision and a greater distributive justice. So they were on the right track. And from time to time, Joe Biden speaks about the dignity of work, which I think is a theme that has been missing in Democratic Party public rhetoric and discourse, the dignity of work. But I would not say, and as you point out, Bernie Sanders and Elizabeth Warren did not prevail. They were not neoliberals. They are not subject to the same kind of criticism I've been making. I think the one element that's missing, even in their political rhetoric and argument, is to connect a critique of neoliberalism and the way the global economy has been carried out, to connect that with values and with identities, and even with, and this is a word that conservatives have monopolized, even with patriotism. Because part of what I think many working people resent about liberal politicians is that even though they may offer policies that would help working people, tax breaks, more generous health care, family leave, sick leave, what liberals are not as good at speaking about is the sense of community and patriotism and belonging. Part of what people resent, I think, about the version of neoliberal globalization that we've seen in recent decades, beyond the outsourcing of jobs, beyond the wage stagnation, is the sense among elites that national community doesn't matter, that we don't owe anything in particular to our fellow citizens, because the global economy is what matters, that we should identify, as many in the professional classes are inclined to identify, not with particular parochial, rooted or situated communities, national or regional or local, but the world as a whole. And this way of thinking about citizenship, it's closely connected to the embrace of neoliberal markets, the free flow of capital and goods and people across borders. But it misses something that everyone aspires to, which is a sense of belonging. And it's very difficult to articulate a sense of belonging to a particular place if the only framework is a global economy. And so I think the left needs to find a way to connect the language of patriotism and belonging and community to its critique of the economy. And then I think there would be a kind of language that would enable liberals and center-left political parties to speak more powerfully to the aspirations of working people, and to win back some working people who have been attracted to the hyper-nationalistic, xenophobic rhetoric of the authoritarian populist right. The left needs, I think, and liberals need an alternative language of community and patriotism and belonging. It's not enough to offer policies alone. What do you think about that, Rune? Do you think that's plausible?
I think to a certain extent that they should, and I mean, it's hard, what I'm going to say now is going to sound ridiculous, but I mean, they should try and listen to Donald Trump at times, because he has a way of talking to people when he especially talks to their aspirations and their hopes and their concrete lives and dreams. You know, he says a lot of horrible things, but, you know, there's this survey that said that Donald Trump had the vocabulary of a fourth grader. And people were laughing about it. But actually, I think that is a democratic virtue, to speak like that and to speak a language that everyone could understand. I think you're absolutely right that even Bernie Sanders, who does not talk about employment, but about jobs, and Bernie Sanders, who does not talk about opportunity, who doesn't use the neoliberal framework, he does not like to talk about values, because that is something that belongs on the right. And I think, I don't remember if it's liberalism and the limits of justice on democracy's discontent, that you say that the procedural republic is not enough. The civil rights movement is not enough. And I think that is just a huge challenge, to develop a leftist language for belonging in a certain place. And I think as long as we don't have that, the right will keep monopolizing it.
Yes, I would like to talk about the importance of bringing values and moral argument into the public square. You're right, Rune. This has been a theme for me for a very long time, going back to my first writings years ago. I think liberalism makes a mistake to insist that citizens leave their moral and even spiritual convictions outside when they enter the public sphere. The impulse is understandable. The impulse is that we live in pluralist societies. People disagree about values and virtues and the best way to live. People disagree about all sorts of moral questions. So the liberal impulse is to try to define a framework of rights without embracing or affirming any particular vision of how to live, any particular conception of the good. And I've been arguing for a very long time that, first of all, it's not possible to define even rights in a framework of justice in a way that's neutral toward conceptions of the good. But the attempt to try the liberal politics that would insist on a procedural republic leaves a moral void in public discourse that sooner or later will be filled with narrow, intolerant moralisms, whether from religious fundamentalism or from strident hyper-nationalism. These are the default alternative sources of value that people will draw upon to fill a public sphere in a pluralist society that is empty of values and moral discourse. So I argue in The Tyranny of Merit, but it's an argument I've been engaged in, Rune, for some time, that we need a morally more robust kind of public discourse than the kind to which we become accustomed. We should not shy away from bringing into political argument and debate moral arguments, questions of values. And just as you mentioned the civil rights movement, I actually think that was a movement that was not a purely liberal movement. I think the civil rights movement was inspiring as an example, precisely because Martin Luther King and others drew freely and frequently on moral arguments and sometimes religious arguments to make the case for desegregation and civil rights. But we've lost that habit. We've lost that source of inspiration and political resonance. So I think we need a morally more robust kind of public discourse, and that liberalism makes a mistake if it tries to pretend that there's a way of deciding hard questions about how to live together without inviting citizens to debate fundamental ethical questions.
I have one last question, something that I wanted to ask you for a long time, and now I get the chance. That is more on a personal level. What was it like for you? You must have been a very young political philosopher when you wrote the book that was so critical of John Rawls. And John Rawls, he was the superstar, the great philosopher. And I think he's a great philosopher, definitely. And his kind of liberalism is very close to what we will call social democracy here in Denmark, and is a very great way of criticizing neoliberalism. I think it's a great philosophy. But what was it like for you as a young philosopher coming out with that critique of John Rawls?
Well, I wrote my first book, which was a critique of John Rawls's version of liberalism. I wrote it. There it is. Wow, you've got it. That's amazing. You have. So this I wrote as my dissertation when I was in graduate school in Oxford. And then it came out as a book a year or two later, the book you just held up. And it was a critique of John Rawls's liberalism, not because I disagreed with the social democratic policies that he favored and principles that he favored, but I disagreed that he could actually get us to those principles in a way that was neutral toward conceptions of the good life, of the issue we've just now been discussing. That was my criticism of John Rawls. The idea that we could detach ourselves, or should detach ourselves, from our fundamental aims and moral convictions and allegiances and identities. That was the issue. And so I began teaching at Harvard in 1980 as a very young professor. And here was John Rawls, a great philosopher, who phoned one day. The phone in my office rang shortly after I arrived. And I picked up the phone, and the voice on the other end said, "This is John Rawls, R-A-W-L-S." Spelling his name as if I might not know who he was. And he was very generous, and he invited me to lunch. He was aware I had written this dissertation, and he was inviting me to lunch to meet and to talk. But I'll never forget, it was as if God called on the phone and spelled his name just in case you hadn't heard of him.
Wonderful, thank you. I was thinking you must have been colleagues at a certain time when you were very young, and he was a very established authority. One absolutely last question, because I have 1 minute more, and this book, I think, is so important because you criticize your own institution, and that it opens for another kind of dialogue, and you criticize a privilege that so many are blind to, and it's a raw criticism. It's a very, very well put and well informed and convincing criticism. How did your colleagues at Harvard respond to your book?
Well, some of my faculty colleagues have expressed sympathy with my perspective, but I'm still waiting to hear from the powers that be, and I'm looking forward actually to engaging in dialogue with them, because I do criticize the way in which universities like mine have been cast in the role of arbiters of opportunity. We're not the sole cause of the meritocratic public culture, but we are quite central accomplices. And I think we need to rethink the role of higher education, even as we need to debate the shape of the economy and the terms of public discourse.
Well, thank you so very much for taking your time. It was a pleasure to meet you and talk to you after so many years. Thank you.
Thank you. I've really enjoyed it. Thank you so much.
And to everyone who's been watching, I think we have some great news, like Donald Trump would say, great news. That this book we've been talking about, The Tyranny of Merit, which is a very, very important book. We've bought it here at Informationsforlag, and we will be translating it, and it will be out in Danish this summer. Thank you, and I wish you all the best.
Great. Thank you so much. Thanks. Bye-bye.